Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Luke Shelton.
I'm Sarah Westvick.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guests to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/Tolkien Experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. In a way, an introduction to our guest for this episode is completely unnecessary. But I just had to take a minute to tell you how elated I am that I had the opportunity to sit down and interview Ralph Bakshi for our podcast. He is a revolutionary animator who had a remarkable influence on the industry during the 60s and 70s. And for many of our listeners, he was their first visual experience of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. His film still stands the test of time, and he still contributes so much to so many in terms of their Tolkien experience. Before we get into the interview, I wanted to take just a moment to apologize. Unfortunately, our recording software was not working well on the day when we sat down to have this interview, so the audio quality is a bit lower than it normally is. I want to thank Mr. Bakshi for putting up with a little bit of difficulties on our end and still persevering to give us a wonderful interview anyways. So without putting off any further what we all came here for, let's go ahead and jump into our interview with the one and only Ralph Bakshi. So how were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
Well, I was through an animation and artist friend. I lived in the village at the time in Manhattan, and at some parties or gatherings you'd go to, you'd always hear someone say, "Have you read Lord of the Rings? Have you read The Hobbit?" And there's so many books around in those days that people were reading. You heard about it, but you didn't think too much about it. But it was around. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit was around. You would hear it would pop up here, pop up there. And for some reason, it would always surprise you. Through academic circles, there would do some discussions on it, but very minor. On the walls were written "Frodo lives." I never knew what that meant in the East Village. Had no idea what Frodo lives meant. I thought maybe it was a new soda or something. And then one day in my studio, Gordon Bodie, an honest friend of mine, came up. He was carrying a book. I asked him what it was. It was either The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. He said he had just finished it. I should read it. And I took it home and started to read it. And it was, of course, it was extraordinarily great. By the way, fantasy and science fiction were very big in the 50s and 60s. Robert E. Howard, the Conan writer, the pulp writer, was a very big deal. And so we were very much into fantasy, which was starting to break. Had another very good fantasy painter friend called Frank Frazetta, and he was a great fantasy painter, and he talked about Lord of the Rings sometimes. At any rate, I read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, I forget, and it was great.
Mm-hmm. So, in your first reading, what is it that you thought was so interesting? Was it the story itself, or was it the characters, or some of the descriptions? What really drew you into the book?
Everything he said. In other words, the writing, Tolkien's writing is absolutely extraordinary. His pacing is not rushed. You know, a lot of the science fiction short stories we read, were very much fast-paced. They would jump around. But his pacing was slow. His pacing was on the money. His characters talked sense. They talked about wonderful things that you seemed to relate to. There was no hurry about it. Everyone seemed very real. His descriptions of landscapes to me and what people were wearing or dressing were magnificent. Everything he did was so brilliantly written that I was stunned. In other words, I've never read such, in all my fantasy reading or science fiction or pulp readings as a cartoonist, which I was a fan of, no one has ever written so realistically, so well, so patient, He's almost like, like Tolstoy. He was the Tolstoy of fantasy as far as I was concerned.
It's a high compliment indeed. That's fantastic.
Well, are you kidding? It's still that.
So, in your first reading, what was your favorite part or scene of Tolkien's work?
Well, here we go again. Everything. In other words, I was stuck. No, I'm not. First of all, the hobbits were extraordinary characters. How could you not love Bilbo, Frodo, and Gandalf? I mean, there wasn't a character that showed up like Aragorn or Boromir that weren't fully realized. There wasn't any favorite, but there was this extraordinary believability to everything on every page. There wasn't a boring page to me. This is my take on it. There wasn't a boring page. There wasn't a misspelled word. There wasn't an added line. Nothing did not make sense. Nothing did not hook up. And everything that he spoke about, you knew had implications later. Especially from Gandalf. I mean, he was so wise that you knew everything he said was going to happen or come down a certain way. But for those total believability, I mean, those people were 100% real, but of course they weren't. They were writing on printed pages by a writer. When you realize how extraordinary that is, you realize how extraordinary Tolkien was. I told Tolkien's daughter that when I went to England to meet her. But anyhow, so there wasn't any particular favorite. Now, if you talk about Conan, my favorite was Conan, the barbarian. So he was the leader of the pack. But you speak about the Robin Hood stories, it was Robin Hood. When you think of Tolkien, it's everything. Me. So I was very stunned by the whole thing. You have to understand this was stunning writing is what it was.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you go from reading Lord of the Rings the first time to then ending up directing Lord of the Rings and bringing that as a visual adaptation?
But this you're not going to believe, so. Well, you have to believe it. Okay, well, so I read Lord of the Rings. I read A Hobbit. I read the Rings books. It came out paperback. There were 3 books. I went from one to the other and waited breathlessly for the other one to arrive. And, it was everything I've said about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings was true in every book he had written. So you could call me a Rings fan? Yeah. You call me a Tolkien fan. But I wasn't thinking about making it because it was a massive undertaking. And I was very busy with my city films and social commentary films, and I was busy being chased around New York by various groups who thought he's a communist, a fascist, or a murderer. So I found problems at the studio. But I'm sitting in my studio one day, and I'm reading Variety. Variety is a magazine that every Hollywood producer director reads because in Variety, it shows you what other directors are getting deals and gets you mad. If you read it, you get mad. You read to see who made more money than you. Yeah, it's one of those magazines that you read to find out who's doing better than you. And anyhow, so I'm reading an article, and the extraordinary article said that United Artists was thinking about doing a movie about Lord of the Rings. So my mouth dropped open. That was the first time I heard it. They had acquired the rights from Disney, United Artists, because Disney had originally bought the rights from the Tolkien family, but deemed the books too unanimatable and too dangerous for their market, which is when you wish upon a star market. So basically, I thought that this is really interesting because, I love Lord of the Rings. And then they went on to say in this article that the director, I'm not going to mention his name, he's to go crazy, mad at me. So, but the director said he had a great idea, right? And his idea was he was going to take all 3 books, put them into one screenplay, which he did, and he added more characters on his own, new ones, so he could make everything work. I was incensed. I was crazy. I went out of my mind. You have to understand how I feel about Tolkien. I felt the same way about the Brooklyn Dodgers. So, at any rate, so I was a very big deal in those days. I was a very big animator. And so I said, this is ridiculous. So I called United Artists, the head of United Artists, Mike Medavoy, and I said, I have to have a meeting with you, Mike. He said, about what? I said, about Lord of the Rings. I have to have a meeting. So he gives me a meeting, and I tell him, this is ridiculous. You can't do this. He says, Ralph, he says, we never read the books. We don't know what it's about. We don't want to make the film. We spent $3 million on this director's screenplay. $3 million. I used to make entire films for $1.2 million, and there they spent $3 million on a screenplay, right? If you could get me back my money for the screenplay, we'll give you the rights. This doesn't happen in Hollywood. This is the rights to Lord of the Rings for nothing. If you did United Artists back, get $3 million. I said, okay, no problem. Because I just wanted to get this stupid screenplay out of the way before some other company made it, right? So I now have the rights to Lord. This is true. Now stay with me. Now only I could do this for some reason. So anyhow, so now United Artists, the movie company, was in the same building with MGM, the movie company. They were sharing office space in the same big building on the MGM lot. Okay? So I march out of Mike Medavoy's office. He was the head of United Artists. March across the hall to MGM's office, where Dan Melnick, a very intellectual producer, was running MGM. He had done all that jazz, and he did something with all the dance musicals. He was a very, very bright guy. And I knew he would know about Lord of the Rings. So I went into his office. I said, I want to see Dan Melnick. She said, you can't. He's in a meeting. Do you have an appointment? I said, no. She said, well, you can't see him. I said, listen, I told this receptionist, you tell him, you intercom him. This is before we had these fancy gadgets that everyone says. You intercom him, and you tell him that Ralph Bakshi is here with the rights to Lord of the Rings. She said, I can't do that. She said, if you don't do that, I'm going to leave, but Danny's going to fire you. She says, oh, in that case, I'll call him. So she calls him. In 2 minutes, the door opens. Danny steps out. He says, Ralph, you have the rights to Lord of the Rings? I said, yes, Danny. He says, come in my office. And I was going into the office, right? A director, a furious director is leaving. He was having a meeting with Melnick trying to sell him a movie. Now, it's very hard to get movie pitches with the president of a company, so I broke up. I didn't know he was in there. I would have broken it up anyhow, but I didn't know it was him. He never spoke to me again. I wonder why. He just kept so furious. I broke up his meeting. And anyway, I sit down with Danny. I told him about the rights to Lord of the Rings. Amgen will give you the right to make the film if you pay him back $3 million for this director's screenplay. Danny says, you got a deal. This doesn't happen anywhere except in my world, because except coming from Brownsville, Brooklyn, I don't know, we grew up differently in the ghetto. It was like very honest. You could say what's on your mind and move on. We weren't very well educated or versed in politeness. So Danny and I marched across the floor back to MGM. And we walked into Medavoy's office. Danny said, we'll give you the $3 million, so we have the right. Medavoy got on his knees and kissed my hand. I said, you saved me, you saved my life, I got my money back. So we got the rights. I left with Dan Melnick back to MGM. I called my lawyer, and he came over, and we made a deal to do Lord of the Rings. Now, that's all in a morning's work. No agents, no phone calls, no intrigue, just me going from office to office. So when you ask me how I got the rights, I got them because I love Tolkien. If I didn't love Tolkien, who would have bargained? But to go ahead naively and produce and continue on this fashion I don't know, I laughed today. I don't believe I did that even today. I can't believe I did that. And no one will believe it, but it's the truth. No agents, no high pressure, no intrigue at night. Well, people are very simple. If you give them, no one read the books. The problem is with all these movie people is they don't read the books. There's too much to read. Who's got time to read books? You got to read screenplays. You can't read 5 pages of Tolkien without saying it's too slow. You can never make a movie. I want to talk about cookies all day. So that was it. That's how I got to write. And now we're forced to make the movie.
Mm-hmm. That's an incredible story.
For sure. Yeah.
So when you set about to make the movie,
yeah.
I'm guessing because the screenplay was not something that you were a big fan of with the extra characters, did you have to go and reread The Lord of the Rings over and over again to kind of create your own vision?
Wait a minute. That wasn't about, well, first of all, the first thing I did, that's a good question. The first thing I did was I told Dan Melnick and everyone involved, I'll make the film if it's okay with the Tolkien family. I wasn't about, you have to understand my love of Tolkien. When I love someone, first of all, with me, it was always the artist comes first. That's what my films were about. It wasn't about so much collaboration as it was the artist come first. And as far as I was concerned, Tolkien comes first. I'm a far second. Let me be very clear. So they had to set up a meeting with the Tolkien family. So I go to England. I have a lunch with Tolkien's daughter at Oxford, I think, to tell her how I was going to make the movie. And if it was okay with her, I would proceed. If not, I wasn't going to proceed. And she invited her son in, Peter, I think, Tolkien, and he already was trying to sell me something called the Silmarillion. I just waited it. I said, I'm still dealing with Tolkien here. What is the Silmarillion about? But at any rate, he was putting together the Silmarillion book of Tolkien's notes. She took me to Tolkien's studio where he wrote Lord of the Rings. It was a high attic in Oxford, and then she took me into a drawing in the art room at Oxford, I think, of Tolkien's drawings of the rings. He did these very interesting drawings. It was closed, but she took me through it. She gave me the okay, and I went home. And what was one of the things I had told her was that I didn't have to reread the books. I had read the books. I wasn't looking to do anything except what Tolkien, to the best of my abilities, what Tolkien wrote. In other words, I was going to do not one picture. I was going to do 3 pictures. I was just like the book, and I was going to stick as close as humanly possible to all of Tolkien's dialogue and characters, and that's what I gave to the screenwriter. I forget the guy's name. I told him this is what we're doing, and that's what I sold the books to. In other words, I didn't have to reread anything. I was going to do the book. That's what started me. How could anyone have the goal or the audacity or chutzpah to rewrite Tolkien? I mean, you're going to rewrite the Bible because you think you're more Jewish? I mean, what is it? So, I forget the guy's name. He wrote The Last Unicorn. At any rate, for the most part, all the lines in Tolkien in my animated version was right out of the book. There was no changes of lines. Everything was as the characters had said in that particular scene. And I recorded it with the greatest stage actors in England, and stage and theater actors in England. John Hurt and all these great guys that went over to England. And it was so funny. I'm sitting in England recording the voices from the screenplay. Oh, I burnt the other screenplay. So I never read it. I just threw it in the fire. It was so great. So I'd walk into a room, the guy that Fritz the Cat is standing with the greatest, in heavy traffic, is standing with the greatest English actors of that generation in the room, and they're asking me for what's your direction, Ralph. So I say to them, like, just read your lines. I'm sure you'll do fine. And they read their lines, and they did fine. I wouldn't dare give them directions. Once in a while, I said, do it again. And they'd say, what's wrong with it? I said, nothing. I just had to say something. And they all laughed. We had a good time. It was all one take. I never heard, you talk about actors, so I had a great time.
Mm-hmm. So, I know that there are some artists and creators who, once they're done with the project, they kind of put it away and they never go back to it. Was that the same for you with Lord of the Rings?
What do you mean, put it away?
Like, have you gone back and watched the movie ever?
No.
No.
My movie or the other movie?
Your movie.
Not really. It's never good enough. It was very painful. The whole experience for me was very painful due to the producer and the movie company, the distributor. It was very hurtful to me. I had finished part one and was releasing it on Christmas. It was a very, very difficult film to make in animation. And my contract read that it would be it would be written on the billboard as Lord of the Rings Part 1. But that was contractual. And then they called me into a meeting and they tell me that no one was going to go and see just Part 1. That they weren't going to advertise it. I said, what are you talking about? You're going to give the impression it's a finished movie? It's not a finished movie. I ended with Frodo saying, we're going to march on. So they released it that way, and the reaction was horrible because basically no one reacted to the movie. Everyone came expecting to see all three books, and then it was Part 1. The movie ended. They loved the movie until it ended, and then everybody was stunned. So I was hurt very, very badly by it, and that's why I walked away from Part 2 and 3. I wasn't going to work with the same people again. I couldn't even look them in the face. It was a little more violent than that on my part, but I'm giving you why I never did Part 1 and 2 and why someone else did. And they did exactly after I said what I would do, they did exactly what I told them to do. The same distributor. No, it was Warner Brothers. They changed distributors at that point. At any rate, so that's what happened to me on Lord of the Rings. Very hurtful. Very, very hurtful.
Yeah. So have you had a chance to go see other adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, like the Peter Jackson films?
No.
And then do you still go back and read The Lord of the Rings itself?
Well, I read Lord of the Rings to my kids, so did my wife. I have 4 kids, so they were growing up. We read them the Rings at that time. I've read it time to time, not the entire things, various chapters and stuff. Yes, I have. I love Tolkien.
So out of all the different experiences you've had, discovering it early on and then making your own adaptation and then revisiting it some later, what is your fondest experience with the work?
Oh, doing it, visualizing it. Before, I guess Peter Jackson and various other directors of studios take a lot for granted. I didn't have anything to look at. Tolkien's drawings certainly weren't something I was considering animating for the Rings. Rankin and Bass's adaptation was terrible of whatever the hell they did. The most important thing and most enjoyable thing I had was visualizing it. In other words, working with Tolkien and trying to visualize what he was writing about was a big artistic challenge. Like, there were so many options. Like, what does the ring wraith look like? What does Frodo's garments look like? What do the hobbits look like? What is a Shire? All these things, Bakshi Productions and Ralph Bakshi visualized to what you're seeing. And when I caught snatches of another Rings adaptation, was everything visualized was pretty much the studio's concept, my concept, and seemed to work very well. I used Rembrandt as a guide, as one of the major artists involved in rings. So that was the most enjoyable, one of the most artistic things. And I was pretty much satisfied with what the background artists and we all had done. The second thing was shooting the live action in Spain. There was no way anyone could animate traditionally 10,000 or this is before computers and stuff. We had no computers in those days, so there was no way to animate the flight to the fort, let's say, in time to ever finish it. In other words, you can't do 8 horses flying across the field, chasing Frodo, jumping across rivers. Everyone see, it's just too much work. The physicality of that, you can't. So I came upon live action, Rotoscope, which was the tracing of live action, which Disney had done and Fleischer had done when they had difficult stuff to do. Disney used Rotoscope and Snow White on The Prince and the Princess, on Night on Bald Mountain. Fleischer discovered Rotoscope in the early days, so I thought that was a tradition to the way to go, and it was. So I set up a whole live action shoot in Spain, and working with the Spanish stuntmen and dressing orcs, and even in the rough costumes we did, I was able to visualize in live action Lord of the Rings book, and then I was able to retransfer that to animation. So I had the great joy of seeing it live and then seeing it in animation. Again, very unusual experiences for an animator. A lot of work. The exhaustion level was high. Living in Spain was great. I love Goya very much as a painter, and I was able to go to see his paintings at the Prado. And I love Francisco Goya and Velázquez, and I was able to see them, and they entered Lord of the Rings iconology. And we shot, and when I was growing up, El Cid with Charlton Heston was a very big live-action movie, and we shot in the castle in Spain, and we were using the same castle to shoot the orcs. So all this is great stuff. So I enjoyed that. I had a great time. And but I a funny story. So I'm shooting. When you shoot live action in Rotoscope, you don't care if there are telephone poles in the scene. Everything's coming out. You don't care if there are cars parked on the highway. Nothing matters except you're looking to get the action, and then you use the action. Everything else, the action goes to an animator. He draws over the photograph. He doesn't draw a telephone pole. We just have to do motion. So, on the first week of shooting, we get a call from the Spanish lab that were developing the film has quit. The Spanish lab has quit. And why have they quit? They never saw such a terrible director in their whole life. And why? He's saying there are telephone poles in the scene. There are airplanes flying through over orcs' heads. There are cars. There are catering trucks on the highway behind the orcs. I said, please have them come over. So they all came over, and I had to sit down and explain to them that we're not using the footage in the traditional way. They quit. Please, you got to develop the film. And so they didn't understand what I was doing because no one had done such a large movie. In fact, I was the first to do an entire movie that way. So that was funny to a point. Those are the kind of experiences I had.
You've said a couple times that you're a fan of a lot of different things that Tolkien wrote. Have you since gone back to read like the Silmarillion or other works by Tolkien?
No, I saw the Silmarillion. I didn't particularly care for it. It wasn't something I enjoyed. No, I'm pretty much stuck on Tolkien. I'm pretty much stuck on the original novels. I didn't. I had other things to read, and other things to do. There was enough material on the 3 books of Tolkien's and plus the Hobbit for me to be Tolkienized. And I didn't. When I started to read the Silmarillion, I thought maybe I'd do that. I didn't see any reason to do that in the movie. It wasn't as fulfilled or realized as Tolkien's masterpiece was. So it was I had done my Tolkien stay. I had done the best I could. Did an awful lot of work. And we still have the cells that I'm selling. My wife said it's still around the house. Great backgrounds are on the walls. The art that we did is everywhere. So I'm pretty much done with Tolkien to that extent. I'm also 82, so there's not much time left to redo Tolkien,
After all these years of since you first read Tolkien, do you still think that you would recommend him to a new reader? And why would you recommend him, or why would you not recommend him?
Well, Tolkien was writing about, from what I can gather, Tolkien was writing about World War II. In other words, in Lord of the Rings, I felt the darkness that England was going through, the fascism, and all of that was quite apparent. And I think he was a soldier during World War I and served. So the extent that it was hidden brilliantly, but underlining all of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was a tragedy that was happening to the planet worldwide under Hitler's assault on democracy and all the small people of the world after the hobbits. So it's a very historic, valid cry that we could defeat the worst enemies in the world if we have the will and the courage, which is what Gandalf was preaching, or being special enough. So I would recommend that today for the same exact reasons. In other words, the world is in chaos. A right wing is coming back. Fascism has grown to tremendous heights back. Their earth is melting. I did a picture called Wizards, where I discussed the same issues. This is before Lord of the Rings, by the way. I've got to tell you, before I did Lord of the Rings, I did a picture called Wizards, which discussed pollution, the re-rising of fascism, with Hitler returning. But you got to be on your guard all the time when fascism comes back. And then we end up with Trump and other world leaders of similar ilk. So I would definitely read Lord of the Rings is as valid today as it was when we first read it. And so with some of the great other Russian writers and stuff, War and Peace. What I'm saying is, if you don't read Tolkien, of course, Tolkien by today's internet and fast-moving access might be difficult for certain kids to read because it's slow. You have to pay attention to the words. But you have to really think about every page you read because it's quite descriptive. I don't know whether today's kids are into it, kids or young scholars. This I don't know. My instinct says maybe not. But would I recommend reading it? Absolutely. It's great. If you can't read Lord of the Rings, what can you read? Tell me what you would read that would be more interesting. You'd have to show me, but it can't be another spy novel. So of course, absolutely.
Great. Well, I can kind of fill in a little bit there because my research, I did a PhD focusing on the way that readers under the age of 18 interpret The Lord of the Rings.
Good. So I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, and so there is still a very strong group of young readers that go to the work and read the work, often because their parents encourage them to.
Great. That's good news. And they like it. They like it, right?
Yes, very much.
Okay. That's very good news. I had no idea.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with me.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I did want to ask, is there any way that our listeners could engage with you, follow you, support you, that you'd like to share?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. I have no idea what that question means. I mean, I have all the support from people like you. The listeners just make sure they get the word out on why I didn't do 2 or 3. And I think that's important, like what happened there. By the way, Lord of the Rings 1, the film I made, to date, made $250 million, and it's still playing, and people said, and they called it a failure this day. I mean, it's remarkable what happened to me. But no, I appreciate anyone who appreciates Tolkien. Just make sure they get my story correct. And the fact that I created the visuals, that's most important to me. In other words, that me and my artists created what probably is used in every Tolkien movie that's been made since. In other words, how do you visualize this? How do you draw the Shire? How do you draw the interior of the houses and the rooms? That all came from my studio myself. And I think that's the biggest way they can support me. But that's the truth. I like the truth, you know.
Well, thank you again. Thanks so much for joining me.
Luke, that's good. We finally got the connection. Thanks. It was fun.
Okay.
Goodbye, Luke. Thank you.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @Luke B. Shelton.
I'm @SR Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.